The Heddon Zara Spook is one of the best-selling topwater fishing lures ever made. It has been in continuous production for over 85 years. The Lucky 13, the Torpedo, the River Runt, all Heddon. By the 1920s, James Heddon's Sons was the single largest producer of fishing tackle on the entire planet. A company so dominant, it defined what recreational fishing looked like in America for half a century. James Heddon never intended to build any of it. He was a beekeeper. This is the full story of Heddon, from a whittled piece of wood tossed into a Michigan mill pond in the late 1890s, to the world's largest tackle factory in Dowagiac, Michigan, to a wartime production plant that earned the U.S. military's highest manufacturing honor, to the family sale that started a chain of 4 ownership transfers that moved the name and the factory out of Michigan forever. The Dowagiac plant closed permanently on August 9, 1984. The lures still sell. The town they came from never fully recovered. In the late 1890s, a man named James Alexander Heddon was sitting at the edge of Mill Pond in Dowagiac, Michigan, waiting for a friend. He was around 50 years old. He had lived in Dowagiac most of his adult life. He kept bees methodically, scientifically, with the kind of precision that showed up in everything he did. He published a beekeeping newspaper, the American Bee Journal, out of a small office in town. He was not a wealthy man and not a famous one. He was a beekeeper in a small Michigan town on a warm afternoon, waiting for someone who was running late. While he waited, he whittled. He took out his knife and carved absently at a scrap of wood, the kind of thing men did in that era when their hands needed something to do. When the piece got small enough that it wasn't worth carving anymore, he stood up to leave. He looked at the small chunk in his hand and tossed it into the pond. A bass hit it the instant it touched the water. Heddon didn't move. He watched the surface of the pond. He found another piece of wood, shaped it roughly with his knife, and threw it in. Another strike. He stood at the edge of Mill Pond for the better part of an hour, throwing carved wood into the water. Watching bass after bass attack the surface, something was happening here. Something about the size and the shape and the way the wood moved when it landed. By the time he walked home that evening, he was already thinking about how to replicate it. At the time, American fishing was done almost entirely with live bait: worms, minnows, frogs, insects, whatever could be dug up or caught. The idea of fooling a fish with a piece of carved and painted wood was not simply unconventional in the 1890s. To most fishermen, it would have seemed like the kind of claim made by someone trying to sell you something. Fish chased real prey. Everyone knew that. James Heddon was not persuaded by what everyone knew. He was a man who had spent decades observing natural systems and asking questions about them. Beekeeping, done properly, is a science, a discipline of careful observation, controlled variables, and iterative improvement. Heddon brought the same temperament to his lure experiments. He carved dozens of prototypes. He tested different shapes, different sizes, different finishes. He observed what the bass responded to and adjusted accordingly. His early lures were crude frog imitations cut from broomstick handles and painted by hand. He gave them to fishing friends. His friends caught fish on them. Word spread through Dowagiac and into the surrounding counties. Men started showing up at Heddon's door asking for the carved baits. He was still giving them away for free at this point. He was still primarily a beekeeper. But the demand was telling him something that the beekeeper in him recognized clearly. He had found something that worked. In 1901, from a small upstairs room at 303 Green Street in Dowagiac, Michigan, James Heddon offered his first carved lures for commercial sale. The price was $1 each. That was not a trivial sum in 1901, a day's wages for many American workers. But the lures worked, and fishermen who caught fish on them told other fishermen, and those fishermen told others. By the end of the first year, the upstairs room at 303 Green Street was not big enough. In 1902, James's son Will invested $1,000 in the company and joined his father as a partner. The name became James Heddon & Son. That same year, James received his first patent for a wooden plug he called the Dowagiac, after the town where it was made. The lure had a tapered body, a 3-tine hook at the rear, a second hook at the midpoint, and glass eyes set in grommet mounts. It was designed specifically for bass. James described it in his first product catalog in language that was precise, confident, and just slightly ornate. In angling for bass or any other surface-feeding game fish, nothing is gained by making the bait to resemble any living thing. The black bass is primarily a fighter, secondarily a feeder. Therefore, that lure, which excites his belligerency rather than his appetite, is best calculated to place him in the creel. He was not just building a product, he was building a philosophy. By 1904, the company had a sales distributor in Canada and a purpose-built factory in Dowagiac. Will had moved to Mineola, Florida, where he spent his winters testing new lure designs in warm southern lakes before the prototypes were sent back north to be manufactured. It was a more sophisticated research and development process than most companies of that era had for any product. The Heddon organization understood, from the very beginning, that the lure either caught fish or it didn't, and the only way to know was to put it in the water. James founded the National Casting Association in 1907, creating the first national organization to standardize casting techniques and equipment across the country. The association held tournaments, published guidelines, and put the activity of lure casting in front of audiences who had never considered it. Every new tournament, every new newspaper article about the National Casting Association was an indirect advertisement for the idea that artificial lures were legitimate. Heddon was building the market at the same time he was building the products to sell into it. The early catalog expanded quickly. The surface minnow arrived in 1905, a side hook design with 3 long hand-painted gill marks beneath glass eyes, built to 7 to 12 coats of porcelain enamel and guaranteed in writing not to peel or crack. The underwater minnow followed. The crab wiggler, the musky surfacer, designed for the large pike and muskellunge of northern Michigan lakes. Each new lure was tested in the field before it was added to the catalog, and each one came with a kind of specific, detailed fishing instructions that reflected Heddon's scientific temperament. These were not products sold on the strength of their packaging. They were sold on the strength of their performance. In 1911, James Heddon died. He was 66 years old. He had seen his carved piece of pond wood become a factory, a catalog, and a name that fishermen from Michigan to Florida recognized. He had not yet seen what it would become. His sons kept building. In 1922, a Heddon designer created a new lure for the company. He named it the Zaragoza, reportedly because its side-to-side walking action on the water's surface reminded him, he said, of the gulls down on Zaragoza Street, a reference to a particular part of Pensacola, Florida, where he had been testing the bait. The Zaragoza had a slim, tapered wooden body and a retrieve action that no other lure on the market could replicate. When the angler worked the rod tip down and retrieved in short, rhythmic jerks, the lure moved from side to side across the surface in a wide, searching zigzag. Fishermen called it walking the dog. Bass and pike and pickerel found it irresistible. The Zaragoza became one of the most copied lure designs in American fishing history. When the plastic version arrived in 1939, Heddon renamed it the Zara Spook. It has been in production ever since. By the 1920s, the factory on West Street in Dowagiac had grown into an operation unlike anything else in the fishing tackle industry. James Heddon's Sons was, by this point, the largest fishing tackle manufacturer in the world. Not just in America, in the world. The Dowagiac plant produced lures, rods, reels, and accessories. It also manufactured golf club shafts, ski poles, violin bows, and box kites, all products that used the same precision woodworking and finishing infrastructure the lures had established. Heddon salesmen drove a custom-built white van across the American heartland with world's largest tackle box painted on the side. stopping at hardware stores and sporting goods dealers from Ohio to Texas to show the latest catalog. The van was a spectacle. People pulled off the road to look at it. The Lucky 13, the cigar-shaped, double-hook topwater plug that James had sketched in the company's earliest years, was now one of the most recognizable lures in the country. Bass fishermen swore by it. It was available in more than a dozen color combinations. At $1 each, it was not cheap, but the fishermen who bought it knew what it could do. In 1932, Heddon changed the industry again. Plastic had been commercially available for years. No fishing lure manufacturer had seriously attempted to build a lure body from it. Wood was the material of the trade. It had always been the material of the trade. Heddon's engineers and chemists began experimenting with transparent plastic compounds that could be molded into lure shapes. The idea was to produce a lure that in the water appeared to be nearly invisible, a ghostly translucent shape that fish would strike without hesitation. They named the resulting product line the Spook series. The advertising copy described the lures as ghostly transparent and promised that their near invisibility would produce strikes from fish that had learned to avoid conventional painted lures. The first plastic Spook lures had a problem. Early plastic formulations were chemically unstable. Over time, sometimes months, sometimes years, the material would begin to degrade from the inside out, developing bubbles and distortions that warped the body into abstract shapes that no longer functioned as lures. The pre-war Spook lures that survive in original condition are among the most fragile and therefore most valuable pieces in the antique lure collecting hobby. A perfect example can sell for more than $1,000 at auction today. But despite the early material failures, the direction was correct. Heddon had introduced plastic to the fishing lure industry. It would take the rest of the industry another decade to fully follow. Then came the war. In December 1941, the United States entered the Second World War, and American manufacturing converted almost overnight. Every factory with precision equipment and skilled workers received inquiries from Washington. Heddon, with its precision woodworking tools, its finishing lines, and its experienced workforce, was exactly the kind of operation the military needed, not for weapons, but for the components and equipment that a modern military consumed in vast quantities. The Dowagiac plant suspended commercial lure production. The workforce that had spent 40 years painting glass-eyed base plugs in 12-coat porcelain enamel now produced radio antennas for military communications equipment. The same craftsmen, the same factory, different product. The war required it, and Heddon delivered. On March 30th, 1944, James Heddon's sons received the Army-Navy E Award. The E stood for Excellence in Production. It was the highest manufacturing honor the United States government awarded during the war. By the time the war ended, fewer than 5% of the more than 85,000 companies involved in producing materials for the military had received it. A ceremony was held at the Central High School auditorium in Dowagiac. Workers received lapel pins. The Army-Navy E flag was raised over the West Street factory. A fishing tackle company from a small Michigan town had earned a wartime production honor that most of American industry never achieved. When the war ended, the soldiers came home. They had money, the GI Bill, factory wages, wartime savings that had nowhere to go during rationing. They had cars and roads, and a country that, after 4 years of discipline and sacrifice, was ready to relax. Recreational fishing had been a popular pastime before the war. After the war, it became a defining feature of American leisure culture. Hardware stores couldn't keep tackle on the shelves. Sporting goods chains opened across the country. Bass fishing magazines launched. Bass fishing tournaments organized. Heddon was positioned at the center of every single piece of it. The factory retooled back to lures. The plastic formulations had improved dramatically during the war years, and the new Spook series bodies held their shape and color in ways the pre-war versions never had. The Zara Spook, now in stable plastic, became the flagship product of the post-war catalog. The Crazy Crawler, a broad-bodied surface lure, with two rotating metal side wings that churned the water on a slow, steady retrieve, became one of the most unusual and effective surface lures ever built. The torpedo and baby torpedo, in multiple sizes for different water conditions, sold in quantities that required the production line to run at full capacity throughout the late 1940s and all through the 1950s. Every fishing family in America had Heddon lures, not as a matter of brand loyalty, as a matter of simple availability. Heddon was everywhere. The name on the box was as much a part of a tackle box as the hooks and sinkers around it. In 1955, the Heddon family decided to sell the company. The men running it in 1955 were of the third generation. Will Heddon, the son who had invested $1,000 in 1902 and spent decades testing lures in Florida, was long dead. The company was profitable. Competition from newer, lower-cost manufacturers was increasing. Japanese-made lures were beginning to appear in American retail channels at prices the Dowagiac factory could not easily match. The family cited competition and the desire to exit while the numbers were still strong. It was a rational decision. It was also the beginning of the end. The buyers were the Murchison brothers, a Texas family whose fortune had been built in petroleum. To the Murchisons, Heddon was an American consumer brand with strong retail distribution and decades of goodwill. An asset. 4 years later, in 1959, the Murchisons acquired Daisy Manufacturing, the makers of Daisy Bib guns, one of the most recognizable names in American youth outdoor products. The two companies were folded together into a single entity called Daisy Heddon. The world's largest fishing tackle manufacturer was now a division of a BB gun company run by Texas oil money. In 1966, Daisy Heddon was sold again. The buyer was Victor Comptometer Corporation of Chicago. Victor Comptometer made adding machines and mechanical calculators. It had no expertise in fishing, no history with the outdoor industry, and no particular relationship with the culture that had built the Heddon name. The company was a diversified industrial conglomerate looking for profitable consumer brands to add to its portfolio. Heddon was profitable. That was enough. The Dowagiac factory kept running through the 1960s and 1970s. The Zara Spook was still a Zara Spook. The Lucky 13 was still in the catalog. The lures still caught fish. But the reinvestment into the facility was not what it had been under family ownership, and the distance between the decision-makers in Chicago and the craftsmen in Dowagiac was not only geographic. In 1981, Victor Comptometer sold Heddon to a group of 6 Chicago investors. They held the company for 2 years. On November 28, 1983, EBSCO Industries, an Alabama-based holdings company operating under the name Pratco, purchased James Heddon's sons. Pratco already owned the Rebel Lure brand and the largest fishing lure manufacturing facility in the country, located in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Adding Heddon gave EBSCO control over the 2 most significant names in American bass fishing lures simultaneously. The decision to close the Dowagiac factory was made within months of the purchase. Pratco's Fort Smith facility was newer, larger, and more efficient. Moving the Heddon production line south made financial sense. The workers in Dowagiac, some of whose parents and grandparents had built the original factory, were told the plant would close. On August 9, 1984, the Dowagiac factory shut down permanently. 4 owners in 29 years. 1 plant closure. 82 years of Michigan manufacturing ended in a single decision made in Alabama. Today, the Heddon name belongs to Pratco Outdoor Brands, a subsidiary of EBSCO Industries. Based in Fort Smith, Arkansas, the Zara Spook is still in production. So is the Lucky 13. So is the Tiny Torpedo. They are made in plastic in Arkansas and sold through the same retail channels where the original wooden Dowagiac lures once hung. Collectors pay thousands of dollars for the pre-war wooden originals. The factory that made them has been gone for 40 years. In Dowagiac, Michigan, the Heddon Museum preserves what remains. more than 1,000 lures, 140 reels, and 150 rods. At the center of the collection is one of the original hand-carved frog lures from the 1890s, a piece of wood James Heddon shaped with a knife and gave to a friend, before any of it was a business. At James Heddon Park, on the southwest edge of Mill Pond, a small sign marks the spot. It reads, "It was near this spot in the late 1890s that James Heddon sat whittling while waiting for a friend. When he got up to leave, he tossed the small piece of wood into the water, where it was immediately struck by a bass. That seemingly insignificant event led James Heddon to build a topwater lure, which he called the Dowagiac." By the 1920s, James Heddon's Sons was the world's largest producer of quality fishing tackle. The pond is still there, the bass are still there, the factory is gone. The name belongs to Alabama. And every summer, on lakes across America, fishermen are still walking the dog with a Zara Spook, a lure designed 100 years ago by a man who, one afternoon in Michigan, had nothing better to do than whittle a piece of wood and see what happened.